Questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Australians are witnessing an incompetent government that can't explain its plans for a voice, can't deliver its promised $275 annual cut to energy bills, has presided over 11 interest rate rises in over a year and has no concrete plans to rescue families from our worsening cost of living crisis. When will the Prime Minister get across the detail and start prioritising ways to help families struggling with cost of living pressures?
Order. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy will not interject. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for that very concise question, which allows me, I think, fairly to give a comparison between where the government has placed Australia right now and what the circumstances are that we inherited, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition speaks about economy, speaks about social policy, the whole range, and I'm happy to go through it. Unemployment rate now is 3.5%. It was 3.9% when we came to office. Participation rate is 66.8, up from 66.4. The gender pay gap's down from 14.1 to 13.3%. The number of women employed full-time is up from 3.6 million to 3.9 million. The number of long-term unemployed is down from 122,000 to 100,000 people. Industrial disputes. This is a good one, Mr Speaker. It was 128,000 days lost in the June quarter of 2022. You know what it is for the March quarter? The last figures available, 7,700. Remember the industrial relations legislation and the catastrophising of those opposite. Well, 128,000 days lost under them, 7,700 under this government. Inflation, we know, was the highest quarter this century, 2.1%. March quarter 2022. The March quarter June quarter of 2023, 0.8%. Annual wage growth from 2.4 to 3.7. Wholesale electricity prices was $264 a megawatt in the June quarter of 2022. Now it's $108. Gas was $31.76 in May 2022. The August average is $10.73. Private business investment, 10.8 in the March quarter of 2022, 11.3 today. And of course the humdinger, Mr Speaker, the state of the budget. $78 billion deficit under them, under us a surplus of around about $20 billion.
Order. Members on my left. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Hasluck.
My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese government working to normalise our trade relationship with China, and what results have we seen so far?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank you very much for the member for Hasluck for her question. And of course I have said for a long period of time now that we'll cooperate with China where we can, we'll disagree where we must, and we'll engage in our national interest. And the decision by China to remove the 80.5% anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Australian barley should be welcomed by all Australians. Yeah. This is a decision that is good for Australia, but it's also good for China because they get access to the best barley in the world, the best barley in the world. These duties had effectively blocked barley exports worth over $900 million. So this is a decision that's good for our economy, good for agriculture and good for jobs, and I'm sorry that it's opposed by some of those opposite. Because 1 in 4 Australian jobs are in exports. Jobs in export industries have higher than average pay. Trade contributes 30% of GDP, and China is by far our biggest export market. The result is a culmination of over a year of work, and I want to pay tribute in particular to Don Farrell, the Trade Minister, but also Penny Wong, our Foreign Minister as well, for their calm, consistent, responsible approach, standing up for Australia's interests, a sustained engagement that they have had. Our approach has been serious and sustained. We have continued to speak up for Australia's national interests, and we will continue to do so on human rights, on the need for economies and the rule of law to properly operate. But we do say that there is an interest in China receiving our goods, just as there is an interest in Australia exporting those jobs. It is in those goods. It is in Australia's interest to have a stable bilateral relationship with China, and we made it very clear that we were open to dialogue. I met with Xi Jinping in November last year, and I'm sure that we will potentially meet again on the sidelines of the G20 meeting that will be coming up in the future. And I have also overseen a ministerial engagement, including between foreign ministers, trade ministers, defence ministers and others. We have made progress without shifting any of our fundamental positions on trade, on security, on regional stability. We'll continue to do so by having respectful dialogue. That's in the interests of Australia's farmers, it's in the interests of our national economy, but it's also in the interests of security in the region as well, that we have constructive dialogue.
The call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. $900,000 has already been spent on an independent Makarrata Commission for national treaty making. Last week, the Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Treasurer refused to answer questions on how this money was spent. On Insiders yesterday, the Prime Minister failed to explain the expenditure 3 times. Prime Minister, what has this money delivered?
The call to the Prime Minister. The member for O'Connor is warned. I've been clear about this. The time is not to give running commentary before any minister or the Prime Minister gives an answer. And future people won't get warnings on both sides. They'll just simply remove themselves from the chamber. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question. There was a member of a government that had $19 billion. $19 billion.
Order. The member
go
for
to businesses.
Deakin.
Go to businesses that were increasing their profits and didn't see a problem with any of that. Nothing to see here about $19 billion going to businesses that were increasing their profits. Now, Makarrata, of course, is a Yolngu word. It's a Yolngu word coming from Arnhem Land, from the traditional owners, that speaks about a coming together after conflict. That is simply what it means. So Makarrata is about promoting reconciliation. That is what it means. That is what it means. And we make no apologies for saying that. The idea of a Makarrata that has been requested is, of course, a positive one. And yes, we had measures in the budget for it. But of course, we've seen over the weekend as well some commentary as well from people who aren't normally a cheer squad for the Labor Party, speaking about the tactics of those opposite. And they've said this. We are talking about a government putting a referendum to the people to enact a reform designed to unify the nation and eradicate discrimination, a reform devised by Indigenous representatives, constitutional experts and politicians of all stripes across 2 decades of consultation.
We'll just pause a moment. I'll hear from the member for Hume.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. $900,000 has been spent on treaty making. What has it delivered?
The Prime Minister, I'm listening carefully to the Prime Minister. He's talking about the Makarrata process and commission. I'm listening to what he says. Order.
I'm asked about Makarrata was what I was asked about, which is a part of the Uluru statement from the heart.
Order.
And this is what this commentator Chris Kenny had to say.
Order. The Prime Minister has been
He went on
relevant
to
the
say,
topic.
of all stripes across 2 decades of consultation.
The Prime Minister will pause. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, this was a very tight question in relation to the $900,000. Is it your ruling that the Prime Minister is in order and is relevant to the question that was asked of him?
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the point of order on relevance can only be taken once, and I should add, when it was taken previously by the Shadow Treasurer, he took the point of order using a word that hadn't even been in the question when he was claiming relevance.
The Prime Minister has 54 seconds. Order. 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 The Prime Minister needs to remain relevant to the topic of the question. I'm listening to what he says, but he is being interrupted while he is answering the question, so I'll just make sure that he is being relevant to the topic of the question as the standing order provides for.
There you go. Chris Kenny went on to say, yet now the Coalition scare campaign seeks to decry this as a secretive plot to render asunder the nation. He went on to say this.
The member for
It is
Hume
not a plausible
will cease
critique,
interjecting.
and it should not be taken seriously by media or political commentators. It insults the public. The people running the scares know full well they are talking about nothing more than an advisory body. He went on to say, this truly is an attempt to turn Australians against each other. Against each other. That was Chris Kenny over the weekend. And if any of the front benches from those opposite could have been bothered going to Garma on the weekend, what they would have seen was the unity from First Nations Australians asking to move forward together in the spirit of...
The member for Gilmore has the call.
My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to ensure trade impediments do not stand in the way of the agriculture industry achieving its ambition of $100 billion by 2030?
I give the call to the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
Can I thank the member for Gilmore for her question, a great regional MP who understands just how important our agriculture sector is to the nation's economy. Of course, the Albanese Labor government continues to back our agriculture sector. We know how important it is, and to ensure that our farmers, our processors, our exporters have the best possible access they can through the removal of trade impediments imposed by our trading partners. And this while restoring the relationships with trading partners the Liberals and Nationals frankly spent a decade trashing. The announcement on Friday that China will remove the 80.5% anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Australian barley represents years, if the Shadow might like to listen, represents years of hard work from the Australian government, officials and industry. Australia has successfully used the rules-based World Trade Organisation's dispute settlement system to respond to, resolve and to address these issues. We welcome China's decision to remove duties on Australian barley and have made clear to China we expect a similar process to be followed to remove duties on Australian wine. We are confident of a positive outcome. Since coming to office, the Albanese government has been working hard to stabilise our relationship with our country's largest trading partner. China's decision to remove duties on barley is the latest in a series of decisions we have been able to secure from China to remove trade impediments on our agricultural products. Already, over the past couple of months, we've managed to successfully negotiate the removal of impediments on cotton, on timber products and horticultural products, something I would have thought those opposite would be welcoming. This is a feat that they could not achieve when they were in government. While the decision on barley is welcomed, there are a number of products, in particular wine and beef establishments, that are still subject to impediments. We'll continue to work hard to stabilise the relationships with trading partners, and the Albanese Labor government is steadfast in its support of industry's ambition of $100 billion by 2030, evident in the significant market access wins secured since we came to office. Last year alone, we recorded 107 market access achievements where access was established, improved or restored, and that is worth over $5.4 billion to our agricultural sector. We'll continue to work hard to pursue Australia's interest on behalf of the agriculture sector to ensure that we have the best possible international access.
Before I call the member for Clark, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is Federal Councillor Dr Ignacio Casas, Head of the Confederate Department of Foreign Affairs in the Swiss Parliament. Also present is Mr Thomas Ache and Ms Yvonne Ferre, members of the National Council of Switzerland, and a delegation from the City of Swan, including Mayor David Lucas. A warm welcome to you all. Give the call to the honourable member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Financial Services. Minister, the Banking Royal Commission's report was tabled more than 4 years ago, but still at least 18 recommendations are yet to be implemented. Obviously, this is unacceptable and out of step with community expectations, not least because the misconduct discovered by the Commission and the harm it caused was extremely alarming and is likely continuing to some degree. Minister, when will all 76 Banking Royal Commission recommendations be implemented in full?
Give the call to the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services.
Thanks, Speaker. And can I thank the member for Clark for his question and acknowledge that since he entered this place in the same year that I did, he's been an advocate for these issues, consumer issues more broadly, but also was a passionate campaigner for the introduction of a Royal Commission into financial services, something that the Labor Party supported in opposition and the Coalition voted against 26 or 27 times. There were 76 recommendations from the Royal Commission. Of those, some 54 were to government, another 12 were to the regulators and 10 were to industry. I'm very pleased to be able to report to the House that in the first 12 months of the Albanese government, we have implemented a key recommendation that was outstanding from when we came into government, and that was the implementation of the compensation scheme of last resort. I say it's important because upon coming into government there are around 2,000 people who are owed an award of damages that was unable to be paid and that would have otherwise been paid by the compensation scheme of last resort, about $230 million worth of compensation payments, which will now flow because in the last month that legislation has passed through the Senate. I can also inform members of government of the 6 outstanding recommendations to government. I correct myself. I inform members of the House that of the 6 outstanding recommendations to government, 5 of them can be passed this week if the financial accountability regime passes through the Senate. I believe it's on the Senate's notice paper to be considered this Wednesday, and I'd urge the Senate to ensure that that does occur. The final recommendation to government, that I haven't dealt with so far, deals with point-of-sale exemptions in relation to certain credit products, and I propose to deal with that in the context of the buy now, pay later reforms that I hope to bring into the parliament, if not late this year, then early next year, and I think that would be a very important reform to do. If I could point to then the other recommendations, my understanding is that there are 2 recommendations to the regulators that remain unresolved. Both of them require other processes to be dealt with. So, for example, one of them requires the implementation of the quality of advice review and other associated processes that I'm busily dealing with the regulators and the department and the regulated industry on. In relation to the industry, my understanding is that there are 3 outstanding recommendations. One's a bit hard to measure because it deals with a change of culture within the industry. The other 2 deal with not yet time-expired reviews of codes of practice within the industry. I can inform the member and the House more generally that we're committed to ensuring all of this is done.
Call to the honourable member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Trade. What action has the Albanese Labor government taken to pave the way for the re-entry of Australian barley to the Chinese market?
Give the call to the Minister representing the Minister for Trade.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Lyons for his question. We too came into this parliament at the same time in 2016. He's a great Tasmanian representing the great people of Lyons. And I also want to acknowledge how grateful I am to represent here for this question Senator Farrell, a great South Australian, and by his deeds is proving to be an exceptional Trade Minister in the Albanese Labor government. As many in this chamber know, and as has been referenced before by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Infrastructure, in May 2020 Australian barley producers copped an 80.5% tariff when exporting barley to China. That has led to an almost $1 billion a year loss to those grain growers right around Australia, because the duties effectively blocked the export of that barley to the Chinese market. And that is why the news that came out last week that the Chinese government will no longer be imposing these duties on Australian barley is so welcomed by the industry and, of course, by all Australians. There are presently 126 exporters registered to supply barley to China who again have access to the significant market after 3 long years. And of course, there's also great news for Chinese consumers who now will be able to enjoy better beer brewed using great Australian barley. The best barley in the world, as the Prime Minister has commented. Since being elected, the Albanese Labor government has been working constructively with the Chinese government to address a range of trade-related matters which arose during a long period of diplomatic silence overseen by those opposite. As part of this constructive approach, in April, China initiated a fast-track review of the barley industry following agreement between our two nations to suspend the WTO dispute on barley. Now, following Friday's announcement and consistent with the terms of that agreement with China, Australia will discontinue that WTO dispute. This is a great outcome which demonstrates the approach adopted by the Foreign Minister and the Trade Minister of engaging in sensible dialogue and negotiation, which is delivering timely results for Australian industry. Because the reality is, if we had pursued this dispute through the World Trade Organisation, barley producers would not have had a resolution for at least another 12 months, and that is entirely unacceptable for a $1 billion a year industry. We know growers were devastated by these tariffs, and at the time barley was one of the top 3 agricultural exports in the country. Other markets were pursued, such as Mexico, because of course they brew some good beer over there too, but none can match the geographical proximity of the Chinese market for barley, nor of course the population. This decision has been celebrated by stakeholders, and I want to acknowledge the support of National Farmers Federation Chief Executive Tony Maher when he said, "We acknowledge the hard work by the Albanese government to stabilise our relationship with China, in particular Minister Watt, Minister Wong and Minister Farrell, who have engaged constructively on their counterparts on this issue. An exceptional Senate team leading for Australia."
Give the call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. $900,000 has already been spent on an independent Makarrata Commission for national treaty making. What has this money been spent on?
Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Before coming to that question, can I recognise Auntie Robert Reid and her family, who are in the gallery today, the family of Dr Gordon Reid, of course, the member for Robertson. You are very welcome, and it is wonderful to see you, Aunt. Can I thank the member for Farrer for her question? Mr Speaker, I have been asked about the elements of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The government has allocated...
The Minister was about to talk about the allocation of funding, but I'll hear...
With respect on relevance, Mr Speaker, the Minister has not been asked about the Uluru Statement of the Heart. The Minister has been asked a specific question about a specific allocation of funding for a specific purpose, and it's not the first time she's been asked that question.
I thank the member for the point of order. And I hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, that was potentially the most absurd point of order I've ever heard. The last words that the minister said were the government has allocated. And it was at the moment of saying the government has allocated that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, in a prepared point of order, stands up simply to interrupt. It is an attempt simply to interrupt the minister, not to raise a point of order, because the exact words that were being used could not have been more relevant.
The question contained a question around funding and budget allocations. As I heard correctly, the minister was using the words funding allocated, which I think is entirely relevant. I'm going to make sure that she is being relevant and she has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, the government has allocated funding for a Makarrata in line with the commitment that we took to the last election. The funding has been allocated for the NIAA resourcing to progress our commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. But we are not establishing a Makarrata before the referendum. Our priority is constitutional recognition through a voice. As Julie Bishop said at the Press Club, I believe that it is a step in the right direction. It's not a question of money. It's not a question of politicians coming up with policies. It's a question of giving Indigenous people the franchise to make decisions to implement policies that will work. We've got to give this a chance, and I agree with Julie Bishop.
Give the call to the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Australian labour market performing, and how is the Albanese Labor government laying the foundations for more secure, well-paid jobs into the future?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Much more likely to get a question on the cost of living from the wonderful member for Hawke than I am from the Shadow Treasurer. Mr Speaker, those opposite don't even pretend to care about the cost of living anymore or about the jobs market. They've vacated the field. And could that be, Mr Speaker, because inflation is moderating in our economy, our jobs market has been particularly resilient, and we're handing down the first surplus in 15 years, something that those opposite were incapable of, Mr Speaker. But we know that people are still under pressure. And in the face of the Shadow Treasurer's embarrassed indifference, our highest priority is rolling out billions of dollars in cost of living relief and creating good, secure, well-paid jobs for more of our people. And in the face of pressures coming at us from around the world but being felt around the kitchen tables of this country, our labour market has been a source of resilience and a source of strength. Australians have every right to be proud of what we've achieved together over the past year and a bit. 14 million Australians in work for the first time ever. Population share in work the highest ever. The unemployment rate now 3.5%. Down from 3.9 at the election. Overall and women's participation near record highs as well. And, Mr Speaker, the most recent data confirmed 500,000 jobs have been created in the first 13 months of the Albanese government. 13 months is the shortest period to reach this mark for any new government on record. It took those opposite 34 months to create 500,000 jobs. It took Mr Howard's government 45 months, more than 3 times longer than it's taken us. Now, Mr Speaker, despite the outstanding performance of our labour market and our people, we know that high but moderating inflation, higher rates and global uncertainty is expected to slow our economy and push up unemployment in the months ahead. Both the RBA and the Treasury forecasts have unemployment ticking up over time. But this is a remarkable starting point as we enter a new period of uncertainty from a position of relative strength. It's prompted as well, Mr Speaker, a welcome and important focus on full employment and how we manage and maximise opportunities for more of our people. And so, Mr Speaker, the first priority of the Employment White Paper that we will release in the coming months will be finding some common ground on full employment and, in the process, laying out our plans for job security and wages and productivity and skill shortages and addressing the barriers that people confront, even with unemployment, with a 3 in front of it. Because as pleased as we are with the progress that Australians have made together, We know that there is more to do to ensure that people who work hard can provide for their loved ones and get ahead. This is a central feature of our responsible economic management. We're making progress, but we know that there's uncertainty ahead.
Give the call to the honourable member for Riverina.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water, who has federal responsibility for environment and water, just to be clear. I refer to the Minister's question time statement last week, and I quote, "We're not proposing any takeover of state laws. We're not proposing any duplication of state laws. Heritage protection will predominantly remain a matter for states and territories." Given the West Australian government is set to scrap its cultural heritage laws, will the federal minister rule out federal mandatory national standards that require cultural surveys for farmers on their private property?
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Yes. Thank you. Mr Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister for the question. I don't know how often I can say to this place what I said every day last week in question time.
Order.
We are not, for one moment, intending to take on the cultural heritage protection laws of any state or territory. That's true of WA, it's true of any other state that is doing cultural heritage protection reforms. We have our own process in place. That is a process that was begun by the former Minister for the Environment. The consultation with the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance begun by the former Minister for the Environment. We're talking about updates to Commonwealth laws. We're not talking about duplicating, copying, adopting any WA laws.
What's
amazing about this is until very, very recently, not only did the former Minister for the Environment support this process because she began it, not only did the member for Leichhardt support this process because he chaired the two Duke and Gorge inquiries, but the Shadow Minister for the Environment supported this process. He said, and I quote, "Those events were," he's talking about Duke and Gorge, "were so disastrous that they made it clear that comprehensive work needed to begin as a matter of urgency on modernising Indigenous heritage protection laws in Australia." The member for Cowper, of course, has also been a great supporter of this approach. The member for Cowper said, and I quote, "We are very pleased that the minister," that's me in this case, was not the former minister, "has now made it clear that she will be continuing the work that had already begun in this area during the years of the coalition government." He said, "We always considered that it was vital that this process be centred on the views and the experience of traditional owners." And of course, Senator Dean Smith also said, and I quote, that we know that Duke and Gorge, which we know to be of such tremendous heritage value to Indigenous people in the home state of Western Australia, people should ask themselves what has changed. Can I say, again, we have no intention of adopting the WA laws as they were, as they will change. We are the Commonwealth Government. We are looking at the Commonwealth laws and will update them according to the process put in place by the former Minister for the Environment.
Give a call to the honourable member for Pearce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. How will an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice help ensure that no Indigenous Australian students are left behind?
Call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend, the fantastic member for Pearce, for her question. Australia is the best country in the world, and there's lots of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because we look out for each other. Think about when there's a bushfire or when there's a flood. We get together and we help each other out. Mateship isn't some kind of made-up national myth. It's what we do, and it's who we are. We don't leave our mates behind. But there are a group of Australians who are behind. If you're a young Indigenous person today, you're less likely to go to preschool, you're more likely to fall behind at primary school, you're more likely to drop out of high school. And if you're a young Indigenous bloke today, you're more likely to go to jail. than to university. And that's despite decades of good intentions and billions of dollars that have been invested. Now, the No campaign says you don't need a voice because all of the answers are here, that politicians know best. You can hear some of those. You can hear some of those noisy no voices right now. But that unyielding gap between black and white Australians tells us that's wrong. And if we want things to change, then we have to do more than just change what we do. We have to change the way we do things. And that's what the voice is about. It starts with recognition, recognising the fact that Australia didn't start when Captain Cook got here. And it's about listening. This is an advisory committee. When you listen to people, you get better results, you get a better use of taxpayers' money. I said a moment ago that if you're a young Indigenous bloke, you're more likely to go to jail than uni. It costs taxpayers, on average, every year $11,000 to send an Australian to university. It costs taxpayers $148,000 a year to send someone to jail. $11,000 versus $148,000. $11,000 a year to set someone up for life, $148,000 a year to lock you up for life. And if you're a young person in the juvenile justice system, it's more like $1 million a year. Now, what if better policies, informed by listening to people who know what they're talking about, helped more young Indigenous people to finish school and go on to university rather than to jail? That's what we mean when we say better results and a better use of taxpayers' money. And isn't that what we all want? It's not easy. It's hard, but it's worth it. It's about building a country where no one's held back and no one's left behind. And that is what the voice is all about.
The call to the Honourable, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Can the minister confirm that if the referendum is unsuccessful, that all work on a Makarrata Commission and treaty will be ceased by the government?
Order. Order. We'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the way that question's framed, it's in breach, I'd put, of Standing Order 100D7 on hypothetical matter.
I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, clearly it is a question about policy in the area that the Minister squarely has responsibility for.
I would be more comfortable if the Deputy Leader could rephrase it around funding allocations at the moment, moving forward, particularly around that the Minister has responsibility for now, not potentially in the future.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians, and I refer to the $5.8 million of funding within her portfolio budget allocation towards a Makarrata Commission. Can the Minister confirm that if the referendum is unsuccessful, that all work on a Makarrata Commission and treaty will be ceased by the government?
The question is in standing orders barely, but I will allow the Minister to respond.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We intend to get a successful vote.
Give the call to the Honourable Member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Government Services. Who did the Royal Commission into Robodebt conclude stopped Robodebt?
Give a call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
In recent days, there have been many who've claimed to have stopped Robodebt. Last week, the member for Cook claimed he stopped Robodebt, where he said, "I closed the scheme down during the operational phases of the scheme when the issues and unintended consequences first arose." But he's not the first former coalition Liberal minister to now claim credit for stopping Robodebt. Stuart Robert, the former member for Fadden, he also famously claimed credit in this place. He curiously didn't credit the member for Cook for it.
whilst the Commission doesn't deal with the member for Cook's claim that he stopped robo-debt, presumably because no one except for the member for Cook thought that he would ever say that, Commissioner Holmes did have something to say about Mr Roberts' claims. She found the evidence provided to the Commission by Mr Robert on this point to be less compelling. She continues that Mr Robert was informed of the existence of AGS advice warning of potential illegality on the 4th of July 2019. And for the record, Mr Robert decisively acted almost 5 months later. But not to be outdone, there's another former Liberal robo-debt minister who's also popped his head up to claim credit. It's the former member for Aston, Alan Tudge. Breaking the habit of 15 years of parliament, I read The Spectator last week. It was actually sent to me. Mr Tudge outs himself that he effectively stopped robo-debt by removing all the bad parts of the scheme. He writes, I paused the raising of debts, and he lists some other areas which he changed. He then essentially asserts that after his interventions there was nothing bad to see here. I mean, for the record, I remind Mr Tudge that after he civilised robo-debt, it went for 3 more years. There were 156 AAT decisions that the DHS were wrong because robo-debt used averaging to calculate the debt, and there were many articles, and in fact, between 2017 and June 2020, hundreds of thousands of people still robo-debted, but nonetheless, if Mr Tudge wants to claim credit for stopping it, well done. But who really did end the illegal robo-debt scheme? And I draw attention now to the words of the Royal Commission. She congratulates Madeline Masterton and Deanna Marto. These are individuals, citizens, who took on the federal government. She says the litigation of Masterton and Marto in both cases conducted by Victorian Legal Aid played a crucial role in the demise of the scheme. The Royal Commission concludes this succeeded in exposing the illegality of robo-debt when other possible forms of check on the scheme did not. So, to be perfectly clear and answer the question, those opposite did not stop robo-debt until the legal system forced them. And now the Leader of the Opposition has to decide, will he agree with the Royal Commission's findings, or will he keep white-anting the Royal Commission, showing they've learnt nothing?
Concluded. Call to the honourable member for Ryan.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The climate crisis is a massive risk to Australia's and world security, and the White House has released its national intelligence analysis of the threats.
I'm just going to ask the member to begin her question to reset the clock. There was far too much noise. I couldn't hear even where the question is directed. So just ask her to state her question.
Thank you, Speaker. Question to the Prime Minister. The climate crisis is a massive risk to Australia's and the world's security, and the White House has released its national intelligence analysis of the threats, but so far your government has refused to do the same. Prime Minister, will you release a declassified version of the Office of National Intelligence's Climate and National Security Risk Assessment provided to the government last year?
The call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you. I thank the member for Ryan for her question and for, I have no doubt, her genuine commitment to act on climate change. The government does not release Office of National Intelligence assessments that are provided to the National Security Committee. The government doesn't do that, and there's very good reasons why that has been the protocol over a long period of time from both sides of the chamber, no matter who has been in government. But I've made very clear, including in my speech to the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, which is the region's and perhaps the world's most serious gathering of national security and defence experts, including the heads of the defence ministers from, in that case, from dozens of countries, the heads of departments. We had, of course, General Campbell, the CDF, was there, as well as Greg Moriarty, the head of the Defence Department. I spoke there very clearly about my government's position, which is that, consistent with the same position that the Biden administration has taken, climate change is a national security issue. We haven't hidden that. We say it, we talk about it, we engage with the Pacific Island Forum about why that is the case. We engage in all of our international forums, whether it be through the UNFCCC that's been attended by the Minister, whether it be the recent meetings that we had of OSMIN, where I attended a meeting along with our Foreign Minister and Defence Minister, with the Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State for the United States, who, when we met in Brisbane, one of the things that we spoke about was climate change as a national security issue. It's something that is a consistent theme, not surprisingly, from the world, and indeed at the NATO summit, again, that was held in Vilnius in Lithuania. That was a constant theme as well, was the impact of climate change, because it has an impact on food security, it's having an impact on migration, it's having an impact on so many areas of the globe, which is why we have to put it in that frame as well. But the government does not release, and we make no apologies for not releasing national security advice, which appropriately goes to the National Security Committee. That is a position that we have had for a long period of time, and that will remain the position.
Has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Financial Services. Minister, the collapse of the Youpla Group in March 2022 caused enormous damage to the First Nation communities. What warnings about the conduct of the Youpla Group were ignored, and how would an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice help to avoid such neglect in the future?
Give a call to the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services.
Thanks, Speaker, and thanks to the member for Lingiari for that question. Can I just start by acknowledging the great work you've done in your community? I know that you've done outreach with your community about this issue and more broadly nationally. I know you've met with the coalition of peak organisations who are making representations to Parliament on this issue. Youpla was a disgrace. It was an absolute disgrace. You had a dodgy company flogging junk insurance, funeral insurance, to First Nations communities. When it collapsed in 2021, 14,000 First Nation families were left stranded. They couldn't pay for their funerals. We came to government a few months later. There were bodies trapped in morgues who could not be buried. The Minister for Indigenous Affairs and myself moved quickly to put in place an interim arrangement. We're standing in the shoes of the insured. I'm pleased to report to the House that over $2 million has been paid out and around about 250 claims have been made. Funerals are happening. But the thing that's a disgrace about this is the behaviour was well known to successive governments for close to 30 years. This mob had a rap sheet that Chopper Reid would be proud of. You know, for over 30 years, regulator after regulator, state and federal departments were made aware of what was going on. In 2015, Centrelink took them off Centrepay, an acknowledgement that this was a mob that was doing harm to community. But seemingly it took another 2 years before that decision was even implemented. The Royal Commission handed its report to the former Treasurer in 2019. It took another 2 years for licensing arrangements to be put into place, which led to the closure of the fund. The Minister for Indigenous Affairs, when we were shadows, wrote to the Treasurer in 2020 and said, as soon as this happens, the company will collapse and these families will be stranded. Nothing happened. The simple fact of the matter is that for over 30 years, this business was taking advantage of First Nations people, taking advantage of their known cultural practices, trying to make millions of dollars were lost in premiums. And it was known by government and it was known by regulators. But nothing happened. If there was a voice to Parliament, that voice would have been listened to. And whether it was a coalition government or a Labor government, we could not ignore the clear call to fix this mob up. It's time to do this
Treasurer.
differently.
Time has concluded. Give a call to the honourable member for Hughes.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Would the minister outline where $900,000 has been spent on the Makarrata Commission process?
Give a call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for her question? What the question relates to is investing in a better future for Indigenous Australians. The money that has been spent so far has been for NIAA resourcing to progress our commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, looking for ways to come together, to bring people together, to move forward as a nation. We are getting on with the job of delivering for Indigenous Australians. We are delivering $100 million to improve housing and infrastructure in the Northern Territory, 30 new 4-chair dialysis units for training for 500 new health workers, birthing on country in Nowra, making childhood education more accessible by increasing the number of subsidised hours to 36 hours per fortnight. This is an investment in the future of Indigenous Australians.
The call to the honourable member for Paterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry. What's the Albanese Labor government doing to put downward pressure on energy prices for manufacturers? And where has the government received support or opposition to these reforms?
Give the call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thanks, Speaker, and thanks to the member for Paterson, who is a big supporter of regional. He's a big supporter for regional manufacturing and jobs, because Australian manufacturers know that we've got their backs, that we've got a strong plan for Australia's existing and emerging manufacturers, help them grow, thrive, add value, create jobs and export to the world. But we also have stepped up to act when the situation demanded it. When Australian manufacturers were faced with a global energy crisis, with the cost of gas and coal soaring, the Albanese government stepped in, the actions made a difference. The Energy Price Relief Plan, the facts, the numbers are compelling about what it did. Because remember, in the second quarter of last year, the final quarter of the Liberal and National governments, the electricity prices that were confronted by Australian manufacturers, they rose by 60%. You fast forward to the second quarter of this year, where we're predicted to jump 33%, and in actual fact, based on the recent data, they fell by 1.5%, showing that the Albanese government's Energy Price Relief Plan had helped shield manufacturers from the worst of those energy price spikes. Now, here's how industry that called for help to tackle this problem reacted. Now, Capral's CEO, and I just visited Capral's Bundamba facility in the member for Blair's electorate just the other week, they said that the government's actions in the short and medium term, excellent step forward. The Energy Users Association of Australia congratulated the government on a balanced approach, saying that it looked after domestic energy users and the national interest, and Manufacturing Australia's CEO highlighted that governments the world over are intervening to protect customers, and went on to say that the Australian government is right to do the same. So that's the take of Australian manufacturers who knew we stepped up when they needed it most. But what was the hot take of the catastrophiser-in-chief, the Leader of the Opposition? He went on to make a number of big claims. He said that Energy Price Relief Plan was a disaster, said it was a massive con job, and this one was a doozy. He claimed it would lead to blackouts. Blackouts, he claimed. No claim too outrageous or absurd. I guess if the Teflon count is big enough, the embarrassment just whooshes straight off. That's what it does.
The master of disaster.
The member for
Master
Fairfax
of
and the member for
disaster.
Deakin
But
will
what do you
cease
expect?
interjecting.
This is the party of robo-debt, who are only interested when people's lives are miserable, not there to help, voting against energy price relief plan, voting against the National Reconstruction Fund, but always there to back their own political interest above the country's interest.
Has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Minister for Health and Aged Care. 1 in 9 women suffer endometriosis, a condition that causes severe pelvic pain and sometimes infertility. The federal government has funded endometriosis.
Just ask the member to resume her seat. Just for a point of clarification
just
to the
for
Leader of the House.
A point of clarification before the question goes on. Only ministers can be asked questions, not assistant ministers. So I didn't want to end up in a situation where the issues couldn't be raised, but certainly it wouldn't be able to be directed the way that question was.
For clarity, I'll just ask the member to restart her question, to reset the clock, and she can direct the question to the relevant minister.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. 1 in 9 women suffer endometriosis, a condition that causes severe pelvic pain and sometimes infertility. The federal government has funded 1 endometriosis clinic for South Australia, but it's located in Kadina, 150 kilometres from Adelaide, and where less than 1% of the South Australian population lives, leaving women in my electorate in pain without services or support. When will the government fund a clinic accessible to the other 99% of South Australia's women?
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Mayo for her question. I know the Assistant Minister, if standing orders permitted, would be delighted to answer this question. She's put in an extraordinary amount of work, along with members, frankly, particularly female members of Parliament, right across the aisle, trying to work together on finding new ways to support women who deal with this incredibly difficult, challenging, often lifelong condition. As the member knows, there was a competitive process undertaken to implement our commitment to deliver a number of endometriosis clinics across the country, and she is right that the one clinic that succeeded in that competitive process in South Australia is located in Kadina. The Assistant Minister and myself have both received representations, including particularly from the member for Boothby, but others as well, about the restrictions that places on people in Adelaide, but also in other parts of country South Australia, from getting access to this new innovative model of care. So the Assistant Minister is working very hard on ways in which we can have an additional process for additional clinics. She'll have more to say about that in due course, but I'm sure the Assistant Minister would be very happy to have a direct discussion offline with the member for Mayo about the impact that these programs are having, particularly on her constituency.
Give the call to the honourable member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. How is the Albanese Labor government making medicines cheaper for all Australians, and why is the government so determined to deliver cheaper medicines?
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm delighted to take that question from my friend, the member for Canberra. I'm also delighted to report that after our visit to a general practice this morning, she has excellent blood pressure, which is often very difficult in this line of work that we have. She also promised her constituents at the last election, Mr Speaker, that we would deliver cheaper medicines, and that is exactly what we were doing. In just 12 months, we have delivered 3 different waves of cheaper medicines reform, which is already saving Australian patients tens and tens of millions of dollars already. And we're working hard as well, Mr Speaker, to list new cutting-edge treatments on the PBS so that Australian patients get access to the world's best medicines. They're coming on right now at affordable prices. Last month, for example, we listed a medicine called Kerendia, a new treatment for diabetic kidney disease. And now 26,000 Australians will have access to this life-changing treatment at no more than $30 a script, $7 a script if they're concessional payments, $30 a script otherwise, instead of paying $1,000 per year to have access to this relief. But, Mr Speaker, as the member for Canberra intimates, we want to do more. We are determined to make medicines even cheaper, which is why we accepted the advice of the medicines experts who manage the PBS to allow doctors to issue 60-day prescriptions for ongoing health conditions at the price of a 30-day script. It is a policy that just makes sense. It saves patients time and money, halving the price of common medicines for 6 million patients, Mr Speaker. It frees up millions of desperately needed GP consults for much more serious, complex health conditions, and it improves medication compliance. We know that from evidence overseas. This is why so many other countries already do this. And that is why pretty much every patient group and every doctors group in the country supports our policy, Mr Speaker. I hear the interjection, what would a doctors group know about health policy? What doesn't make sense, Mr Speaker, is why the coalition seems so determined to block access to cheaper medicines for 6 million Australians. What doesn't make sense is why the coalition government, when they received the same advice 5 years ago, chose not to implement it, Mr Speaker.
The minister will pause. The minister will just pause without comment, and I'll hear from the manager of opposition business.
Well, Mr Speaker, this question, and I congratulate the member for Canberra, was commendably tightly drafted. There is no reference to compare and contrast. This minister is a serial offender. He's doing it again, and he should be brought, because you're all serial offenders, every last one of you. You should be in the program together.
Resume your seat. The question at the end contained, why is the government so committed to cheaper medicine? I'm just going to ask the minister if he's doing a compare and contrast to make sure he's relevant to that end part of the question. I thank the manager for raising the point of order. And
well, thank you, Mr Speaker. It is so important because for 5 years patients have been shelling out hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars they shouldn't have had to pay because the former coalition government received exactly the same advice that we have received, but they chose instead to back a lobby group instead of the interests of millions of patients. Well, that's not what we're going to do.
Oh, the member for Page is now warned. He's had a good go. Give the call to the manager of opposition business.
My question is to the Prime Minister. In his speech at the Garma Festival last year, the Prime Minister made multiple mentions of the Makarrata Commission and treaty. In his speech at Garma this year, the Prime Minister didn't mention Makarrata or treaty. Prime Minister, what has changed?
I couldn't hear the end. Order. I couldn't hear the end part of the question because there's far too much noise. I'm just going to ask, I couldn't hear the end part of the question. Manager, just... Members on my right, I have to be able to hear the question. I don't have a copy of the question in front of me. So I'm going to ask the manager to...
My question is to the Prime Minister. In his speech at the Garma Festival last year, the Prime Minister made multiple mentions of the Makarrata Commission and treaty. In his speech at Garma this year, the Prime Minister didn't mention Makarrata or treaty. Prime Minister, what has changed?
The Minister for the Environment and Water is warned. No one is to interrupt before the Prime Minister or Minister speaks. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I sincerely welcome that question, which goes to the Garma Festival. The Garma Festival. Now, if it was somewhere where there were issues and problems, then the Leader of the Opposition would have been first there. But because it was a celebration of what's positive, a coming together of Indigenous Australians, he was nowhere near it. So accustomed is he to acting in bad faith that he assumes everyone else is too, Mr.
Member
Speaker.
for Deakin.
Mr Speaker, those opposite should have attended the Garma Festival. But I tell you what was different between last year and this year was that last year at the Garma Festival, the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Shadow Attorney General was there and made a constructive contribution to it. The member for Barara was there, and that gave, I think, the people at the Garma Festival a great deal of hope that there was an opportunity to actually lift up this nation by responding positively to the generous ask that is represented by the Uluru Statement from the Heart. A generous ask that arose after many years of process and consultation, including by Tony Abbott, who established a process when he was Prime Minister for what form of constitutional recognition it should take. Not whether it should take, but what form.
Order.
And in the lead-up to 2017, which Tony Abbott hoped would represent, with the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, the year in which the coalition government would take a referendum forward, give Australians a chance to say yes. But instead, what we saw in between last year's Garma Festival and this year is a walking away of a process. Walking away from a process in which Julian Leeser had been involved since at least 2012. From a leader of the opposition who thought that saying sorry would be the end of the world, now he thinks listening to people will be the end of democracy. That's what he thinks, Mr Speaker. The conspiracy theories are colliding with one another.
The Prime Minister will pause. The member
He's struggling to get his scares straight.
The member for Petrie is seeking the call. The member for Lyons. The member for Petrie. The Prime Minister is talking about what is different from last year to this year in the answer. He can't be more relevant. So I thank the member for Petrie for seeing common sense. Order. Order. I thank the member for Petrie. The Prime Minister in continuation.
Mr Speaker, a Liberal MP belled the cat to Phil Curry last week. He said this: "We can't win the election unless we defeat the Voice solidly. That is, we need to defeat it to get to the election starting line." All about the politics, not about the needs of Indigenous Australians.
Order. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Wills.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. What work is the Albanese Labor government doing to end veteran homelessness, and what is standing in the way?
I give the call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I just say combating veteran homelessness is a key priority for this Albanese government. And this week is Homelessness Week. And the theme of this week is "It's time to end homelessness." On census night, more than 1,500 Australian veterans are homeless. Today, I convened the first of a number of consultation sessions that are contributing towards our new defence and veteran mental health and wellbeing strategy, something that you would think, Mr Speaker, that those opposite would be very interested in. This is implementing one of the recommendations of the Productivity Commission inquiry in 2019. And we heard the perspectives in that roundtable from medical professionals, those that practice in the space of mental health and wellbeing, assisting our serving personnel and our veterans. And they highlighted that in order to be able to help our veterans that are suffering from mental ill health, housing is a fundamental prerequisite. We can't move forward in assisting those that do not have secure housing. So it is fundamental to assisting in developing a mental health and wellbeing strategy that we are also dealing with homelessness. Indeed, we heard that the risk of suicide in the Australian population is doubled if someone does not have access to safe and secure housing. That is a matter that is fundamentally affecting our veteran community. So we know, in trying to tackle the issues that the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide is grappling with, housing is fundamental to that effort. And so the work that our government is doing in bringing forward the Housing Australia Future Fund, which sets aside $30 million to assist veterans that are experiencing homelessness and that are at risk of experiencing homelessness, is fundamental to our veteran community, not only in assisting them with this important issue of homelessness, but also in helping our veteran community that are suffering mental ill health in being able to tackle that, to gain treatment, to gain access to services that they need. It's also fundamental to a very important issue that was raised in the roundtable today, and that's of social connectedness. Because if you have insecure housing, if you don't have a secure location, it is very difficult to put down roots and to gain connection into a community. That's right. These are very important issues, Mr Speaker, and yet, and I'm glad you support how important they are, and yet those opposite and their friends in the other place are failing to support the Housing Australia Future Fund to release $30 million to support our veterans that are experiencing homelessness and at risk of homelessness. So in this Homelessness Week, it is time to end homelessness, and it's time for those opposite to get on with supporting the House.
Has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. In March, the Prime Minister stated the Voice is not about defence policy, it's not about foreign affairs policy. Yet a member of the Prime Minister's referendum working group, Sally Scales, said the Voice should be consulted on AUKUS, Australia's most important defence and foreign policy since the Second World War. Will the Voice be consulted on the location of AUKUS submarine bases and nuclear waste facilities?
Order. Members on my right and the Minister for Skills will cease interjecting. Order. Members on my right. Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Defence is not my portfolio, I'll point out, and perhaps the Minister for Defence might like to take the question. But before he does that, can I say to you that the imagination you have is commendable. And the voice is about two things. It is about listening, and it is about changing the practical outcomes for First Nations people. And if the Minister for Defence wants to add to that, I invite him to.
The Minister for Defence and Deputy Prime Minister. Continuation. Order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Voice is not about defence. The Voice is not about parking tickets. The Voice is not about any of the issues that we've been hearing those opposite talk about, as they have been doing everything to talk about what the Voice is not rather than what the Voice is. In July, I had the enormous privilege to attend the Yule River Bush meeting, where there was a call to action around the issues which affected First Nations peoples in the Pilbara. They were talking about housing. They were talking about education. They were talking about community safety. These are the issues which go to the persistent and stubborn gap which exists between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australians when it comes to social disadvantage.
The member for Fairfax will leave the chamber under 94A.
Is going to be focused on. And the difference between the politics that we see played here in the questions that have been asked by those opposite.
I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Just on relevance, Mr Speaker, the question was about statements made by Sally Scales about the breadth of what the Voice will cover. Can the Defence Minister clarify, is he going to tell the Voice what it will cover?
The Minister is answering the question with respect to the issues around AUKUS and nuclear waste and defence bases in his capacity as Defence Minister. And and I can barely hear what he's saying. One member's already been removed. If that level of interjection continues, while I'm speaking, it's not helpful for people to interject. Order on both sides. The Defence Minister has the call.
The difference between the politics being played by those opposite in here and the issues that were being raised by the Yule River Bush meeting could not be more stark and more manifest. In all the issues that they raised, I can tell you defence bases did not come up once, nor did the issue of parking tickets.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Point of order. Mr Speaker, why is the Deputy Prime Minister mansplaining to Sally?
Order. Order. When the House comes... Order. Order. Members on my right. I'm going to deal with this issue. The member for Groom, the Deputy Leader has abused the standing orders in a pretty serious way and she'll leave the chamber under 94A. The Defence Minister is going to be heard in silence. He has the call.
An ethos which underpins every political party in this chamber is that our country is about having a fair go for all. And yet right now, by virtue of one group of Australians' birth, they live shorter lives, they get access to less education, they are less healthy and they are more poor. That is what the Voice is going to be focused on. And so long as that gap persists, it is an offence to the idea of the Australian idea of a fair go for all, and we need to deal with that, and that is what a Voice is about.
The call to the honourable member for Lalor.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Sport. How have the Diamonds World Cup victory overnight and the Matildas World Cup surge changed sport in Australia?
The call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Lalor for her question and for her ongoing passionate devotion to women's sport and lifting up women and girls' participation in sport. And I know, like many Australians, she was up well past 3 this morning cheering the Diamonds on, and I thank her for her form. What a game, made even better by the fact, Mr Speaker, that from broadcasting to camera crew to commentators, it was all women this morning. Firstly, I want to give a huge congratulations to the Diamonds, to coach Stacey Marinkovic, to captain Liz Watson and to her team for trouncing the old enemy England. Bravo. A 61-45 defeat of the Roses, Kira Austin with an MVP performance of 15 goals, a fairy tale ending for Ashley Brazel. The Diamonds just secured Australia's 12th Netball World Cup championship in 16 attempts since 1963. Our female athletes are excelling on the world stage. Our female athletes are changing sport in this country forever. The Women's Football World Cup has ended any and all arguments about the popularity and importance of elite women's sport. Women's sport is not a phase, it's not a nice-to-have, it's not a charity. It is thrilling, it is brilliant, and it is here to stay. The Women's World Cup is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to foster inclusion, diversity and participation for women and for girls. Just look at Matilda's 20-year-old superstar, Mary Fowler. Mary grew up in Cairns, sleeping in caravan parks and learning to play football on Mission Beach. She's now kicking literal goals in front of record global crowds. Sport has completely changed Mary's life. And because it is always more than sport, it is always beyond the result as well. The successes we are seeing are not cures. Women still face major barriers on many fronts: societal, cultural, procedural. And although there is strong women's participation in grassroots sport, girls are far less likely to progress to our high-performance or professional roles than men are in this country. Far less likely to become sporting officials, far less likely to become sporting chairs, far less likely to become sporting CEOs. In Tokyo, 51% of our Australian athletes were women, but less than 20% of the coaches were women. But sport can be a driver for inclusion. In the lead-up to the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, we must and we will use sport to help tackle issues of race and of gender. This government is determined to support people to achieve their dreams, from playground to podium, and from unmown suburban lawns to walking out onto a World Cup pitch in front of 80,000 people. Just like Mary Fowler, just like Alana Kennedy, and from my lips to God's ears, just like Sam Kerr at 8:30 p.m. tonight.
And on indulgence, the Prime Minister.
On that very positive note, Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.